Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog. And today we're covering Acting Under New Descriptions by Paroxysms, aka Ghost of Christ 1, aka Christopher Language Lashes Angry Ghost. Let's get to the substack. Now, I would suggest you either listen or go read. Listen to me talking about and annotating, or go read Ian Hacking's Making People from the London Review of Books, not New York, before going here. All right. For those of you who are listening, we start off with an image. It is Hans von Marie's double portrait, Marie in Limbach, 1863 Bavarian State Painting Collection, available from Wiki Commons. It's very 19th century. During the 1980s and 1990s, the philosopher Ian Hacking became fascinated with how new ways to be a person arise. Studying normal forms of identity, or what he called new kinds of person, just as they were starting to emerge, could, he realized, tell us a great deal about the origins and function of the identity phenomenon. And by this we mean all identities. All ways of understanding relationality are semiotic content. Both, actually. These sorts of case studies could show us how new identity categories were constructed, why people came to be defined by them, and what kinds of treatment and social value newly classified people received in return, and how they were moving targets that actually changed as things accumulated on all points of a relatively complicated social hierarchy. This form of study could also be a way of turning the observing lens back into the supposedly neutral and objective institutions that make up these new kinds of people. Institutions were not simply in the business of assigning and recognizing, as these categories are not platonically real, unless you're a Platonist, in which case, good luck, Konya. They were other important feedback mechanisms at work, with sometimes discerning implications for those who worked in the institutions themselves. The initial case studies that Hacking selected to work with through his arguments were jarringly confrontational. The first was a therapeutic fad of multiple personality disorder diagnosis, MPD, that began in the United States in the early 1970s. The second was the widespread moral panic surrounding the so-called satanic ritual abuse, SRAs, which originated in Canada in the early 1980s and reached its peak during the late 1980s and early 1990s, although people went to prison for it more in the early 1980s. And while it originated in Canada, it spread in LA. And while it also spread through conservative groups, there was actually liberal groups who prompted people to change the way that therapists were interacting with the child, which led to a lot of the pulled accusations. There's a complicated history of it. It makes no side of the American political process looks good, and the Canadian process either. And while, yes, Canada is a much more progressive country than the United States, it's not that different culturally. Hacking was always careful to distinguish experiences and phenomena from the truly overarching ideas and concepts that arose to explain them. He fully acknowledged that child abuse was a real phenomenon with a long history. It wasn't simply summoned into being by the medical and criminological language that institutions belatedly developed to describe it. And he also thought that with autism, as we saw in the article the other day, that the conditions we ascribe to the autism spectrum are probably real, are almost definitely real. And yet it's hard to speak of autism before the diagnoses were in play, because the diagnoses inform parts of the conversation. However, he argued that the idea that a very large number of children were being ritually abused in satanic ceremonies was clearly a new and perhaps bad idea. The police forces, social workers, therapists, academics, and psychiatrists across the Western world were suddenly willing to recognize and validate these new concepts, expose the contingencies and limitations of institutional knowledge, and also dealt with different kinds of institutions. Relatively liberal academic institutions, which had taught people to trust a child and prompt based off that, ran straight into conservative religious cultures with very clear agendas, and the two led to a new third thing which spread throughout American and Canadian culture like wildfire. While these established institutions might seem like the ultimate source of the epistemic authority, what the multiple personality disorder and satanic ritual abuse episodes demonstrated was that in practice they could be swayed by radical new forms of sense making emanating from non-institutional forces. The 1989 to 1991 satanic panic in Britain, for instance, originated with a small group of Christian fundamentalist social workers who were converted into ardent believers in satanic ritual abuse after reading sensationalistic accounts of it in the American news media, particularly Michelle Remembers, which I remember having in my house. It was a weird book. Right. In 1989, they began inviting American experts on satanic ritual abuse, themselves drawn from conservative Christian networks, like the 700 Club, just as a memory, because I lived through this, guys. I remember this. I remember people burning my CDs and my mother's copy of Interview with the Vampire and fear of this stuff. To present at local conferences and raise awareness of the phenomenons like the presence in Britain. Primed by what they were hearing and reading in their professional networks and assuming that they were simply adopting the latest best practices. God, I hate that term. I study educational best practices. I almost got a PhD in it. And the reason why I'm studying it is a lot of them are based on really, really bad, spurious correlational research. But anyway. Like correlational research where the correlations are made invalid by things that are easy to track, like laws. British social workers soon began to find that what they were looking for. The result was a series of regional panics and court cases across Britain through 1990 and 1991, which had already happened in the mid-'80s in the United States, by the way, and in the early '80s in the United States and Canada. As social workers and police misinterpreted the ordinary size of childhood neglect, dissociation, and fantasy in sensationalistic terms of the new scientific satanic ritual abuse sense-making frame. What applied the concepts also went for the humankind associated with them, the victims of satanic ritual abuse who had recovered previously hidden memories of abuse with the aid of therapists, usually using hypnotherapy, was a new kind of person that had not previously existed. The multiples who could potentially manifest dozens or even hundreds of distinct personalities or alters with ages, genders, occupations, nationalities different from their own was also a new kind of person. One that we saw in media portrayed well into the aughts, by the way, even after it had been kind of abandoned for dissociative identity disorder, itself a controversial piece tied to dissociation and PTSD. But one that's on a little bit more solid framing than multiple personality disorder. And people with dissociative identity disorder do not really see full scale like identity shifts or multiple personalities. They experience memory lapses that change their relation to people or disassociations. It's fun. I know someone with it. But I'm also would not be surprised if we discovered that some of these responses are still primed. Patients presenting with split or dual personalities, when chaste and law-abiding, perhaps the other reckless and promiscuous, had previously appeared in the psychiatric record, notably in the late 19th century France, but they were strikingly rare. The kinds of MPD patients that therapists were encountering by the 1990s, however, a woman from Chicago who had many ulcers, including a 300-pound male truck driver from Alabama, another who presented as, among other things, a lobster during a therapy session, were entirely new. What had in the early 1970s been an extremely well phenomenon mushroomed into what seemed like an accelerating epidemic. By the early 1990s, studies were suggesting that as many as 1 person in 20 had dissociative disorder. And then it all went away. Hacking summarized the conditions under which the people came to believe in the widespread reality of MPD, are multiple or altered personality, in a following way. In the early 1970s, a few American psychiatrists began to diagnose 1 or 2 of their patients with what had then been called multiple personality disorder. These cases, initially tiny in number, created a certain buzz around the diagnosis within the psychiatric profession. They even made movies in the 1970s that I saw in psychology class in the 1990s. No, I'm not making that up. I watched Sybil in psychology classes if it was valid. Right. In 1973, this therapeutic trend gained a decisive entry point into popular culture through the best-selling book Sybil. Sybil straightforwardly had taken as a fact by its first readers, although it has since been debunked as a fraud. Sybil chronicled the purportedly real-life case of a woman who developed 16 distinct personalities as a result of a howling childhood of domestic sexual abuse. You know, what we now would call complex PTSD triggers. And complex PTSD is another contested diagnosis. Contested diagnoses are fun because they often don't have a pathology associated with them. All right, they have events and clusters of symptoms. Sybil was adopted into a made-for-TV movie in 1976, where Sally Field's in the lead role. Told you, watching in high school. Hugely popular during its initial 2-night run and frequently rescreened afterwards, Sybil was subsequently seen by as many as 1 in 5 Americans. Like I said, I watched it in high school. Did I repeat that 3 times? Maybe. With its growing public visibility and therapeutic cachet, the multiple personality diagnosis began to act as a powerful category attractor for what Hacking called unhappy people looking for a conclusive explanation for their problems. However, the various players in this diagnostic network were not independent of one another, and their actions changed both the official understanding of the condition itself and the symptoms and the behavior of those manifesting it. The MPD label itself, the patients diagnosed with it, and the knowledge about the condition formed a web of interrelationships. The experts who deployed the label in the institutions that they staffed were also implicated in this network. The whole phenomenon was, as Hacking described, a moving target. We already talked about this essay. Every component within it was fluid and subject to change and revision. Now, remember, Hacking used autism as a countervalence for MPD because he thought the autism's cluster of things were quite real and existed before the diagnosis did, but there was no way to be autistic until there was various stages of the modern associations of the diagnosis. Whereas he thought MPD was probably a non-existent phenomenon and seemed to be somewhat even skeptical of dissociative identity disorder, or at least resident about it. Disassociating under therapy and anxious perhaps to perform their roles as authentically as they could for their therapist, the MPD patients started producing rather more alters than the initial MPD description suggested they would. Many more than even the 16 personalities supposedly possessed by Sybil. This fed back to an accelerated official knowledge of the condition's diagnostic criteria. See the DSM revisions. However, the patients themselves were also moving targets, capable of learning about the condition and assimilating its models and descriptions into their own systemologies and self-understandings. People look up their diagnoses once they're given to them and start portraying the roles, often without being consciously aware of it because of social priming and social pressures. No, I'm not making that up. Hacking called this the looping effect, the consensus that emerged amongst practitioners that childhood sexual abuse was the root cause of MPD. For instance, MPD patients began to recover the abuse memories that conditions involving clinical descriptions suggested that they must have. And this is identical to what happened with satanic ritual abuse, isn't it? All right. They thereby became, in effect, new versions of the people they were before with new memories of what happened to them in childhood. And remember, memory, my friends, are remade every time you think about them. Moreover, these newly recovered memories seem to explain the kinds of unhappy people that had subsequently become. Moreover, these newly recovered memories seem to explain the kinds of unhappy people they subsequently become. These new kinds of people emerging from the various survivor moments that arose from the early 1970s onwards showed the concepts of identity were changing and within themselves history, memory, selfhood, and consensus reality itself. Consensus reality not being the same as actual reality. They seem to poise to expand the set of phenomena that could possibly exist in the world, rewriting our sense of the human self, or at least the human mind in the process, or in this case, selves. And all these new and highly mobile self-understandings developed in accordance with the evolving model of MPD that sufferers encountered by their therapists and psychiatrists. Reading the clinical literature of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and attending patient support groups, people outside of MPD community were informed about the condition through media and popular culture. Magazines and newspapers, and the spectacular appearances by multiples in their alters on shows like Oprah. Hacking would call this interrelationship between the official and vernacular of patient knowledge semantic contagion. I like semantic better than social contagion because social contagion is literally how all ideas spread. Semiotics would be a social contagion. Are the content of a semiotic will be a social contagion. That's not really useful if that's how ideas are understood and all knowledge is socially constructed and social contagion. Semantic contagion is more interesting because it's a new limitation of a priorly existing symbol. That's me explaining what's at stake here. Back to hacking. It was via the avenues of description and media representation that clinical concepts escaped from the lab of academia and entered the wider population. The built-up detail and sensuality around the new identity categories, adding to their socially attractive force. These were conditions under the people found themselves acting under MPD description, conforming to its evolving diagnostic criteria, or perhaps convincing themselves that they too might have the condition, having seen it modeled so comparatively by others. Then, from the mid-1990s onwards, the bubble of MTD suddenly began to evaporate. Hacking suggested that the key determinant in this process was the label itself. In 1994, the DSM-4 redescribed the condition not as MPD, but instead as a dissociative identity disorder. Yeah. With a new clinical emphasis on disassociation rather than multiplicity, it seemed as though there was no need for anyone for the florid arrays of alters that prior sufferers had attested to as proof of their conditions. Although this was still portrayed in like popular media into the aughts, as I mentioned, there were still shows about multiple personality disorders well into the aughts. Newly skeptical of multiplicity, psychiatrists began to treat patients' alters not as separate personalities in their own right, but as something more akin to delusions. Stripped of their clinical aura, the alters started to disappear. We all sense on some level that identity categories are in a state of motion, reconstituting themselves and flowing into new territories. But there is also a corresponding desire to fix identity in place. Strategic essentialism, folk Platonism, all these things are ways to do this. Strategic essentialism is deliberate. Folk Platonism is kind of just the way we kind of think innately because we like to believe categories and we're substantive as they are. To believe, as with Rhythm writes, that our current identity frameworks are static and unchanging. We are encouraged to assume that terms and understandings have most recently become best practices have somehow always been with us. Like, we just got better at finding it, not that we changed what it meant. And we are asked politely to refrain from noticing as the past is silently remodeled in their image. We talk about sexualities of people in the 4th century when there was not really a concept of sexuality. Yes, people had sex, but there was no concept of sexual identity the way we think of it now. Anyway. And we are asked politely to refrain from noticing the past is silently remodeled in their image. I've read that twice, sorry. But I actually think that's a really important hit. Because another thing I've noticed is like people trying to give stats to the number of people that were, for example, a certain sexuality. And while I don't think people really choose their sexualities or their gender identities in most cases, I think there's a lot going on there. And they're statistically variant throughout time, or historians and people from the time period are lying about things at which they wouldn't have incentives to lie to us about since they wouldn't know we would have existed with our categories. All right. Despite a celebration of flows of potentials, contemporary identity politics has a way of petrifying fluid states and recently formulated understandings into static and timeless seeming categories. Yep. Honestly, I also even think when we talk about workerism, when we reduce workerism from a class position and a class habitus, which are themselves two separate things, into an identity, that we're turning that into an identity too. New states of being are defined and then added to the drop-down menu of permissible identity expressions. The undefined flows of feeling and their associated sense that something is lacking, hackings and happiness, are thereby conducted into magnetic categories of identity and held in place by the powers of social and institutional recognition. Rather than constructing our identities, we are led to believe that institutional identity frameworks merely recognize and describe what are already there with ever-increasing sensitivity and detail. And I've gotten in debates with so many liberals about this, but I just do not think that is always true. But I want to be clear about this. It doesn't mean the cluster of traits that are associated with an identity aren't real. Right? Just because the traits are socially constructed and given a frame, which is the part of it that is socially constructed, doesn't mean the things that those traits are describing do not actually exist. And does not mean we're creating them out of nowhere. But by identifying them, they start becoming clear and develop throughout the world. And I tell you that ancient people knew this. I keep on mentioning Buddhist epistemology, but dependent co-arising is literally has this understanding of the world that as concepts start to emerge to other concepts, their relationality and temporality creates new concepts, and that's how identities emerge and also dissolve. If you go into the Melinda Pata, which I've talked about as being aimed at Greeks because it was in the kingdom of Bactria and aimed at the King Mohinder or Melinda. And is very much, even though it is a piece of Buddhist literature, got the Greco-Roman dialectic structure that you assume with Plato and whatnot. You can definitely see them taking aim directly at a theory of forms and a theory of fixed identities, both that they saw existing in Greek thought and in Hindu thought, and going at it with dependent co-arising, but trying to ask people what a wheel was that wasn't also something else, and how that anything essential to it was beyond its use. Kind of fundamentally against Aristotelian thinking. This constantly updating system of identity has become so noticeably resistant to acknowledging that socially constructed nature of new forms of identity expression are the roles of new communications technology play in their viral spread. I've been noticing this with the way people have picked up on narcissism and then can't read prior mentions of what narcissism meant and are they Freudian or general talking points as the same thing as what we mean by narcissistic personality disorder today, and it clearly wasn't the same thing at all. All right. Those who argue that certain phenomena are social constructs, that is, contingent outcomes that are just that may just have easily not existed. I'm not always sure contingent means that they may just as easily not existed, but that's a whole different story. Have often proceeded to a second and logically unwarranted proposition that whatever is socially constructed is also illegitimate and should therefore be abolished or at least drastically reformed, except for the ones that we like, of course. Yeah. Those with a stake in new identities are therefore inclined to take a defensive position and deny or downplay their social constructedness or technological mediation. Yeah, they are. They will claim that, although new expressions may seem like novel phenomenon, they have, in fact, a long and previously unrecognized histories and precedences. And often some of the traits that they link to these identities do have long histories and presences, but not in the way we understand them now, and not in a way that is articulable now, and not without dealing with the fact that our current articulation actually kind of limits and redefines their experience. In practice, this takes up the form of reinterpreting previous identity phenomena in the light of current descriptions, retroactively casting them as an early expression of what we now know to be true. The past is effect made compliant with our current understanding by re-described in terms of our time. We therefore succumb to the illusion that not only has our current worldview always existed, it hasn't, and doesn't even everywhere today, but our current concepts have a universal applicability across time as well as space. As effective as this technique is for defending our beliefs against attack, its overall effect is to close off certain lines of inquiry. Yep. Just because rapid technological change often generates moral panics does not mean that the effects of current digital revolution should be ignored, nor indeed should it imply that previous moral panics were necessarily misguided. Well, I mean, they probably were misguided, but they probably weren't entirely misguided. And this is, where it's hard to parse things. Questions remain open. To what extent are contemporary forms of identity thinking socially constructed? Pretty much all of them are socially constructed because language is socially constructed. I don't even think that's a hard question. Now, the question is what those social constructions of languages and semiotics have to do with their structural content, and that's where things get a little bit more tricky. Is it universal or not? And I don't think that's easily figured out. See the Thomas L.O. and Chomsky debates. How are they shaped by norms and functions of our new digital technologies? How are these habits of thought disrupting our ability to take the past in its own terms? Oh my God, is it? Hacking's account of multiple personality and satanic ritual abuse give us some terms and concepts for initial investigation. Looping effects and semantic contagion describe how the technical institutional knowledge can escape into the world via media representations. Oh my God, can they? Providing a template for new kinds of understanding that we found unimaginable before. The idea of acting under new descriptions describe the process by which the diagnostic criteria can shape new kinds of person. Finally, hacking's account of satanic ritual abuse and multiple personality survivors interpret their past in terms of their newly recovered memories relates to the process of historical redescription. Although it's more personal history than general history, but whatever. Whereby the past, as it was, becomes unbearable and must be remade to the present image to enable us to maintain our sense of self. Now, I'm going to say this. This last bit is analogous, but it isn't really the same as what they were doing in the MPD and SRA cases. It is not just that people were reinterpreting past history. They were literally rethinking memories and giving them new content. That's not just an interpretive move, and that's an act of creation. And it's an act of creation you're at risk of doing every time you remember something, by the way. That's how memory works. You don't actually retrieve an image of the past. There is no wax imprint of the past in your mind. You retrieve some semantic data that your brain pulls up and then recontextualizes, and you remember it in the context of all the other times you remember it, but you are recreating parts of it each time. That's how you can accidentally give yourself false memories. Hacking never suggested just because something was socially constructed that it wasn't somehow valid or real. I actually agree with that. Remember this thing I'm talking about the set of traits. Often the traits are describing things that actually exist. He was not a straightforward debunker. In the work he published in the 1990s, he even allowed for the possibility that satanic ritual abuse was occurring in North America in some limited sense. It kind of wasn't, but whatever. His analysis of what he terms transient mental disorders in the 19th century Europe, hyperpedestrianism and fugue states, for instance, indicated that whatever the causes were of these relatively short-lived phenomena, they were nonetheless real for those who experienced them. Hacking's impatience was with those who were determinedly oblivious in the face of discomforting sorts of evidence about the supposed objectivity of labeling and diagnosis. And I agree with him, frankly. He realized that what was most disturbing about the cases was how they undermined any comfortable assumptions about individual autonomy and coherent selves who choose or just know, as well as the inerrancy of up-to-date and well-intentioned clinical practices. Now, again, ancient. I don't mean to sound like a person who's trying to push you ancient Buddhist thinking, because you can't think like an ancient Buddhist. You don't speak Pali or Buddhist Sanskrit or one of the ancient languages that it's related to. You don't exist in that epistemological framework, and you probably don't practice their religion. But it's important to note that they really did have some of these concepts already mapped out. He realized that what was most disturbing about these cases was how they undermined any comfortable assumptions about individual autonomy, coherent self who chooses just knows, as well as the supposed venerably up-to-date, well-intentioned clinical practice. Sorry, I've read that twice again. It might be the case that we are not, after all, sovereign individuals making free choices, but our minds, memories, and inclinations are subject to wider and much more fluid networks of social production and influence. And that we're also not completely determined by our genetics with this, which is usually the other way this is presented. The contemporary language of identity politics, with its labels, categories, and diagnostics, provides a dominant system for making sense of all sorts of these questions. Examples of the sort what hacking investigators suggest that we need to break out of this way of thinking if we're to get any fuller understanding of where we are in the world and what the world might be doing to us in turn. I would say identity politics is an interesting problem here because, again, the clusters of things that they might be describing are very real. And most people who talk about like race or gender actually admit they're socially constructed, but what they mean by that is often very, very fluid, isn't it? Hmm. So it goes, right? I want you to think about what this means. I am not invalidating anyone's identity or saying they don't really exist in a social construct in a way that invalidates their internal feelings. I am saying their internal feelings emerge from social priming, which gives those internal feelings more and more meaning. There's material reasons for this, and the social is a material force. Once you accept that, you don't have to go back and read everything else back in history or assume that what you are has always existed in the way that it exists for you. It doesn't mean that it's not some sort of base level universal human experience. There is, but like trying to figure out the species being of a wolf, figuring out the base level human experience of a person without sociality is pretty much impossible because being social and being prime socially is part of what it means to be a human being. So perhaps we should be a little bit more forgiving of the way all these identities are used, are not used. And with that, protect your peace.